Protests, of course, continued over the weekend, and I feel like I begin every Monday with that sentence. Protests continued. Probably isn't necessary at this point to say it, and it probably isn't necessary either to do this, but I will anyway. Here's a very quick montage showing some of what happened in Portland over the weekend. Watch this.
Lives matter! Black lives matter! Black lives matter! Black lives matter!
If that looked like a Bible they were burning, that's because it was a Bible. We have now officially reached the book burning phase of things. But I suspect that anyone who has remained sympathetic to the protesters through all of this will not be disturbed by this development of book burning. Sure, I'll align myself with book burners, no problem, because that always works out well historically, right? Nothing to be disturbed about here. But the incident from this weekend that I really want to focus on is this little exchange down in Austin. Protesters were once again blocking the roads, just sort of standing aimlessly in the street, as they do, interfering with people's lives simply for the sake of interfering. And then a black man drove up who apparently didn't have time for their nonsense.
Hey, look, I understand the cause, I appreciate it, but I gotta go to work. I'm black. I gotta go to work. I got bills. I got kids. Get the out my way. I'm about to air this out, bro. Come on. Come on, bro. Come on. I gotta go to work.
I got bills, I got kids, I gotta go to work. He raises a good point, doesn't he? And that point again raises a question often posed about these protesters, which is, do these people have jobs? Apparently not. I mean, they're out in the street every single day for weeks on end holding signs. It's hard to see how they could be gainfully employed in the midst of all of that. So we have a bunch of people who aren't really contributing to society, who aren't productive adult members of society, but who nonetheless expect us to listen to their political views and take them seriously. My question is, why should we? Why should we take them seriously? Now, granted, the government has put millions of people out of work with a series of some of the worst policy decisions we've seen, certainly in modern times anyway. And you could always use that as an excuse for them. It's not their fault that they're unemployed and they have nothing else to do and that's all goes back to the government, you might argue. But I don't fully buy that excuse because for one thing, if you did lose your job because of the lockdowns, I would think you'd probably be spending your time pursuing other job opportunities rather than protesting. But for another, more to the point perhaps, this is not a new thing. The left has a never-ending supply of people who have nothing to do but protest. And this is something that easily predates the pandemic, so you can't really blame it on that. How quickly we all forget it was only back last fall that environmentalist wackos, you remember this? They were doing the same thing all over the country, and in other countries too, standing in the middle of the street, blocking traffic, sometimes even blocking trains from going by, commuter trains. This went on for weeks. There was no pandemic, there was no shutdown then, and there wasn't a pandemic or a shutdown back when we had the first round of BLM protests, starting with the justified killing of the violent criminal Michael Brown. So while the shutdowns are no doubt a contributing factor, the fact remains simply that shutdowns or no, there is a sizable portion of the American public that apparently can afford to spend their days doing activism because someone else, mommy and daddy perhaps, or Uncle Sam maybe, one of those family members, is supporting them and funding their lifestyles. What we find in that video that I just played and in so many other videos like it that we've seen is the stark divide between, on the one hand, people who have nothing to offer society, who are just standing in the street, getting in everybody's way and calling that activism. And on the other hand, the people who actually keep the country going, the people like that man in the car, the people who pay all the taxes, support families, and do all of the actual work of sustaining and maintaining a human society. Now, I guess we're supposed to believe or pretend to believe that both groups have equally valid and important points of view and that both groups should be listened to and taken seriously. But I disagree. I'm not really interested in what the latter group, in fact, I should say I'm only really interested in what the latter group, the real grown-ups, have to say. And that brings us to, I think, a related issue, mail-in voting. President Trump has obviously been on a tear recently, making a fuss about all the states that are planning to push mail-in voting for the election in November. The primary concern Trump seems to have about this, the primary concern that many on the right have about this, is voter fraud. And I understand that concern. I think that there's validity to it. But I also think that the right-wing obsession with voter fraud kind of misses the point and is, in a way, an easy out, a more politically correct route around the real issue with voting and with our democratic process as it currently functions. The real problem with voting, and I've argued this many times, and this is by extension the problem even more so with mail-in voting, is that there are too many people doing it, and it's too easy to do. This has already been the case with voting in general. Mail-in voting will only exacerbate the ever-present problem. If voting is not important enough to you, if it's not enough of a priority to expend any real effort to do it, then you shouldn't be voting at all. Your voice is not needed and would probably do more harm than good in the voting booth anyway. And if you are a non-contributing ignoramus, someone who has no real stake in society and who contributes nothing of substance to it, who is not productive, and who knows nothing about our system, then you should not be able to participate in it, at least in the capacity of a voter. Voting ought to be a privilege reserved for informed, grown-up, contributing members of society. If you aren't paying taxes, then you shouldn't have any say in where tax money, other people's money, goes. And if you are woefully ignorant of even the most basic facts of our system, then you shouldn't be able to, by wandering into a voting booth, or worse, by mail from your home, muddy the waters by randomly casting a ballot ignorantly with no idea of what you're even doing. We don't let people drive on highways that way. Why should we let them drive the republic that way? The consequences, after all, are just as dire, if not considerably more so. Now, I wouldn't advocate for taking First Amendment rights away from protesters who are ignorant, non-contributing dummies, as tempting of a thought as that might be at times. No, they have the right to speak their mind, of course, though they don't have the right to do it in the middle of the highway, and they don't have the right to do it while throwing Molotov cocktails. But my concern is that the attitude we're told we're supposed to have towards these protesters, the idea that their opinion is just as valid as anybody else's, also makes its way into the voting booth. And it shouldn't. If you're not an informed, tax-paying citizen willing to expend a minimal effort to register your vote, minimal effort meaning just leaving your home on one particular day, going to a polling place and voting, then you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Ignorant, non-contributing, non-productive people can march through the city annoying everyone, as is their right, but they shouldn't have the right to dictate the direction of the country via the ballot box. And this is why there should be some very basic restrictions to determine who can vote. Voting should be reserved for people who are tax-paying adults, and adults these days probably means more like 25 instead of 18. With extended adolescence being a real issue as well. So tax-paying adults who can pass a basic 6th grade civics exam. That's my proposal. These restrictions would not exclude anyone based on basic facts about their biological identity, which they can't control or change. Obviously, excluding people from voting based on sex, race, ethnicity is wrong and illegal and should be. But excluding people based on behavior and choices is another thing altogether. Voting is not a God-given right endowed by the Creator and meant to be shared by all people, no matter what. We already restrict voting based on several factors, and not all factors that actually a person can change. As it stands right now, if you're 7 years old, you can't vote. If you're a convicted serial killer, you can't vote. Most people, now the left is trying to change both of those. Okay, they're going way in the other direction. And as always, the left has no problem advocating for things that seem radical, and in fact are radical, until they don't seem radical anymore because they get their way. So they're just gonna go, they're gonna shoot for the mountaintops all the time. And so now there are leftists who would say, convicted serial killers should vote from prison. if they're even in prison, if we even keep them in prison at all. Children should vote. You know, maybe eventually the right will learn to do the same thing rather than constantly, move as the left moves the culture, moves the, as they are advocating for the most extreme leftist position, they move the mainstream position left with them. And what the right always does is they move along with the mainstream position. They always want to stay there in the mainstream because they say, well, if we're too radical, no one's going to listen. But the right should be responding with the opposite. Say, no. This is not how you run a functioning society. By trying to involve literally everyone in the voting process, even to the point where eventually, yes, they're going to have 12-year-olds out there voting. As it stands right now, though, most people who are not radical leftists would say, now probably if I were to make a guess about what most people in the mainstream would think, everything I've said so far, many people in the mainstream would think that's too extreme, that's even horrific and horrible. How dare you? Voting is a sacred right, and how dare you say these things? Yet, I would also guess that most of those people would say that, well, sure, we're not going to have 12-year-olds vote. Why not, though? Why don't we have 12-year-olds vote? If you're not in favor of 12-year-olds voting, why? It's not enough to say, oh, they're minors. What does it have to do with anything? Who cares if they're minors? We call them minors, fine, but what is it about them that should exclude them from voting? Could I suggest what it might be? I think it's that they're not productive contributing members, tax-paying members of society, and they don't know a damn thing about the system. They are ignorant and non-productive. Now, when they're 12, that's not their fault. All 12-year-olds are that way. 12-year-olds are supposed to be that way. But so if we exclude 12-year-olds on that basis, why shouldn't we exclude 32-year-olds on that basis? So if the 12-year-old, we say to the 12-year-old, you can't vote because you're ignorant and non-contributing, and then when they turn 18, even if they're still ignorant and non-contributing, we say, okay, you can vote now. Why? Why didn't we just let them vote when they were 12 in that case? What's the difference? So I do think this is a discussion we should be having more often. And if we're going to be talking about problems with our voting system, rather than focusing all the time on voter fraud, I think this is the real sort of fraud that's being perpetuated on our system. And we should be talking about it. Hey, you right there. Hit the subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It's somewhat appreciated.